Hi, Sharon. Yeah, thanks for joining us. Not snowing today. It's positively tropical here in Edinburgh today. It's, I don't know, 16, 17 degrees. Celsius. Sorry, I should say Celsius. I have not learnt my lesson of daylight saving blunders.
But you said daylight saving instead of daylight savings, so good job.
I'm learning very slowly. Oh, that sounds lovely, Vanula. Right, well, perhaps we'll give it just another minute as people are still flooding in. Well, we've been having some conversation, Michelle, about space heaters, so I hope you're warm.
Actually, it's warm enough that I can sit outside, like compared to what it has been. I'm sitting outside in the sun with a rug, sometimes with a hot water bottle, but enjoying the sun.
That sounds nice. Oh, that sounds fantastic, Julie. Well, I hope you get a lot out of the session, and we'll be sharing some resources afterwards. And as it's being recorded, you can always refer back to it as well if that'll be helpful in future. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I'm delighted to be chairing this RSVP Digital Salon on teaching with 19th century periodicals online. The format we're going to take is 4 short presentations, and I'll introduce each speaker in turn. So just to let you know, partly for the speakers, how I've got your names, just there's no particular order, but I just so happen to write your names down this way. So if Melissa's all right to begin, and then Jennifer, and then Lindsay, and then Jim. So I'll introduce you each as we go, and then we're going to have the question period be all together at the end in order to allow us time to think about the different possible kind of connections between the papers, and also I think it's just helpful sometimes to give you a bit longer to think of the kinds of questions you'd like to ask. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Melissa Range. Her paper today is Using Digital Newspapers in Teaching 19th Century African American Writers. Melissa is the author of 2 collections of poetry, Scriptorium, a winner of the 2015 National Poetry Series, and Horse and Rider. Her 3rd collection, In Progress, is an archivally driven collection that examines the abolitionist movement in the 19th century United States, which sounds really exciting. Looking forward to that. Range is the recipient of awards and fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts, the Rona, Jaffe Foundation, the American Antiquarian Society, and the Fine Arts Work Center in Provincetown. Originally from East Tennessee, she teaches creative writing and American literature at Lawrence University in Wisconsin. Over to you, Melissa.
Well, thank you so much, Helena, and thank you all for being here. Can you hear me okay? All right, great. So I initially wanted to share many activities with you, and I have chopped my PowerPoint way down. I think Jennifer is smiling because she did the same. So I'm going to quickly share my screen with you and get right into it, and we'll just see how far I get here. And let me play from start here. All right, so what you're seeing here is a crazy collection of mastheads from newspapers. And so I wanted to start with this insane looking collection in my presentation on using digitized newspapers in teaching 19th century African American writers, because one thing I have noticed consistently in teaching classes on 19th century Black writers is students are really surprised as to just how much periodicals activity there was by Black writers and editors in the 19th century. So most of them know who Frederick Douglass was, and some of them may have even heard of his newspapers, the North Star and Frederick Douglass's paper, but they usually think that's about all there was, and there were so many. So I wanted to just give a kind of a patchwork quilt here of some of the ones that I've looked at in my classes. Hold on here, okay. So I like to start here with this, which I think is a very powerful statement of purpose. This is an excerpt from the first issue of Freedom's Journal, which was the first newspaper published by Black editors in the United States. And these editors were Samuel Cornish and John Russwurm. This statement to me is kind of everything about why I teach with Black periodicals. We wish to plead our own cause. And they go on to say, too long have others spoken for us. I take this as a statement of purpose when I teach my classes on 19th century Black writers, because as a teacher, and especially as a white teacher, I think the best thing I can do is give students the tools to find and to hear these writers and also to become part of the audience. So using 19th century Black periodicals is kind of the primary way that I center Black voices in the 19th century literature classroom. And I want to just share with you a few questions that guide my approach, you know, kind of why I do this. Because I am not, like many of you, I'm not a trained scholar, not a trained periodical scholar. I'm a poet who just really likes old newspapers. And so when I started bringing this into my literature classroom, I was trying to kind of think about what would happen. You know, I had these questions in mind. How can reading Black newspapers from the 19th century expand narrow ideas of who we think 19th century Black writers were, but also who 19th century Black readers were? You know, I never teach from anthologies. I really just don't like them that much. But, you know, if you do teach from anthologies, you know that what students learn about writers tends to be from the head note in the anthology. And I wanted students to find more than that. And so that's one reason I started doing this. And also to kind of put themselves in the place of 19th century readers. And practically, you know, I don't know about y'all, but most students take my classes on 19th century writers because they're trying to fulfill a requirement of a time period for an English major. And so I wanted students to find ways to get more invested in the time period. And to me, that meant plunging them into daily life, and what better way to do that than by reading a newspaper. Here are the databases I use, and you know, each institution will have wildly different access to databases. So the three that my school has access to are African American newspapers, which is just as it says, all African American newspapers all the time. Great quality of scans and great coverage, so entire print runs of many Black edited newspapers. America's Historical Newspapers is a larger database that includes all of the African American newspapers database, and also many, many additional newspapers edited by white editors. And it can be helpful for additional context, especially when we're talking about abolition in the class, because many of our writers were abolitionists. And so there are many white edited abolitionist journals that can prove helpful for supplementary information. And finally, Accessible Archives is a nice one. It has some newspapers the other two databases don't have, which is why I use it. The scan quality isn't as good, but there are transcripts of everything in the issue. So that can be helpful. You know, I like looking at all that 19th century print online and ruining my eyes. That's why I wear glasses. But, you know, not everybody likes that. So transcripts can be good. So these are just three that I can recommend and that I use in class. So, okay, I can't take you through all three activities because I learned that took about 30 minutes. So I'm going to briefly tell you about the first two. And I want to let you know now that I'm happy to talk about any of these activities in the Q&A. or to do a demo if needed. And I have 3 assignment sheets that I'm happy to share, whether that's at the RSVP website or in the chat or whatever format would be most helpful. I can share those. 3 activities I like to do. The first 2 are shorter ones to be done in class. One is just finding the author, or sometimes not finding the author. I teach a lot of non-canonical writers, so sometimes you just don't find the people. So this is just a very much like a treasure hunt kind of assignment, using databases, typing in the author's name or the name of the author's work, and just seeing what we find. And sometimes we find surprising things, like, David Walker wrote The Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World, which is a really, fiery political tract. It wasn't very well known, that he also ran a thrift store in Boston. That was his work. So that was something interesting to kind of think about, what communities was he involved in. The second activity, reading a serialized novel in its original context. If you are lucky enough to teach a serialized novel and the newspaper that it appeared in is also digitized, these are 2, conditions that may not be met all the time, but you can do this, and it's super fun to go to the newspaper issue and just, I tell students, pick a chapter of the book, find it in this newspaper, and then read it, but more importantly, read what's around it. So we read a 19th century novel called The Curse of Caste by a writer named Julia Collins. She publishes it in the last few months of the Civil War. The novel is a very interesting governance novel that doesn't mention war at all, but all around these chapters of this book that are being published in the newspaper are letters from Black soldiers, are discussions of the end of the war, are ads from formerly enslaved and now freed people trying to find their family members. So all of that is happening on the same page with this book. So it's super interesting. And again, both of those activities can be done in class. But the one I want to tell you about is a more involved presentation assignment where a student chooses a writer and chooses a newspaper issue, and then reads the entire newspaper and kind of reports back on contexts and audience, because I think it's a very interesting assignment and I learned so much from it. Obviously, don't read all this. I have an assignment sheet with all this information, but I do like to give students very detailed directions whenever I have them go exploring. So this is just to give you a sense of all the stuff that will be on my assignment sheet. So what I ask students to do is they choose a writer and they go into one of these 3 databases, and I ask them to look for a relevant year. So for example, we're going to look at Paul Laurence Dunbar, who's a wonderful poet. If you've never read him, I highly recommend. He's one of my favorites. He published his book, Lyrics of Lowly Life, in 1896. So obviously I would tell the student first, try to find a newspaper, a Black newspaper from 1896. And then if possible, determine a location that's relevant to the writer. So Dunbar grew up in Dayton, Ohio, and we'll see that what has been found here by the student is a newspaper from Cleveland, which is not too far. So then from there, the student chooses a newspaper, and I ask them to read the whole thing and just to pull out anything that's interesting. Newspaper articles, newspaper poems, weather, and I will tell you, they love the advertisements, and I do too, because I think looking at the ads really tells us what's important to people who are reading this. So then I asked students to give about a 20-minute presentation to the class about the writer's historical context. So my question here is, in your reading of the culture that produced this writer, tell us anything you notice about how the writer fits or doesn't fit into the historical context, or how the historical context informs the writer's work. So from there, the students give their presentation and they do 2 or 3 discussion questions. So I'm just going to give you a couple of slides from an archival expert presentation on Paul Laurence Dunbar. So the Cleveland Gazette is the newspaper that this student chose, and it is a newspaper that was founded in 1883 and went all the way up to 1945, edited by Harry C. Smith. And so this is very interesting. Buckeye letters, what is that? So Ohio is known as the Buckeye State. So what is happening here is as I read this, I can see, and the student, talked to us about the fact that this seems like the society pages. So if you can see this, what is going on among our people in the various Ohio cities, where the visitors are or have been, what the churches, literary, and other organizations are doing, other personals, hymeneal and obituary. So everything from weddings, funerals, and church stuff. So here we see in Lorain, Ohio, both churches were well attended Sunday. Mrs. M. Carroll has moved to the country. Here, I noticed that Mr. Henry Deering has malaria fever. Reverend C.S. Gee has returned for another year. And an interesting program was rendered at the Missionary Society on Sunday. And this actually, I looked at this issue. This goes on for like 4 columns in this issue of the paper. So what I learned there, and what the student talked to us about in their presentation, is that community is obviously really important. Like what is the Black community doing? And I don't mean Black community like there's one. I mean like the Black community in Lorain, the Black community in Ravenna, the Black community across Ohio. And so the student very wisely connected this to this Paul Laurence Dunbar poem called The Party. And The Party is a Dunbar poem that is about enslaved people who have a huge party with dancing and feasting and all kinds of fun while their enslavers are away. So it's a poem that is set more than 30 years before the time period that Dunbar publishes his book. He was not alive during the time of slavery. His parents were both enslaved, but he was born free in Dayton, Ohio. So he's writing about a kind of socializing that he may have learned about from his parents' stories, or he may be making it up. We don't really know. But it's interesting to compare, what kinds of socializing are being portrayed. The kinds of socializing in Dunbar's poem are much more folksy. There's fiddle playing, there's dancing around. This is very much like, this person's visiting this person at their home. This person is, doing something at church. So there's more kind of private homes and private institutions that were not possible during slavery. So those are some interesting comparisons. And quickly, I'll show you one more here. This is an ad for Howard University in Washington, D.C. And so the student noticed, what kinds of subjects were being offered at Howard. And Howard is, in the United States, one of our most esteemed historically Black colleges and universities. At this point, it's a pretty new school. And they're offering things like theological, medical, dental, pharmaceutical, law, college preparatory, normal, industrial, the latter including printing, carpentering, bookbinding, tinning, and sewing. So the student came up with this really interesting question. How are these subjects reflected or not in the kinds of work and or the interest of some of the speakers or characters in Dunbar's poems? And what I thought was interesting about that is the class immediately noticed, Dunbar in a lot of his poems talks about farming, lots of agricultural poems. And Dunbar, grew up in a city, never farmed a day in his life, but his parents who were enslaved did have that agricultural knowledge. And he has tons of poems about farming. But that is not something that Howard, which Howard is in a city, so that may be a practical reason it's not. But this is not something that is being offered as something that young Black people going to college should learn. There were schools that really kind of put that forth, like a school, Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. It was very much kind of farming related. That's one. There is college preparatory. It's possible that poetry was included in that, but poetry itself is not mentioned. And so Dunbar also has many, many poems and lyrics of lowly life where he talks about the work of the poet or the work of the singer. And so it's interesting too to think that is not really being put forth as a career choice. And in fact, as a poet, I can tell you that it's probably not being put forth as a career choice now either. But it is a really interesting contrast to think about, Dunbar, we really get a sense after reading a newspaper that's contemporary with Dunbar's publishing, we really get a sense of just how nostalgic some of his poetry is, because he's really kind of looking at things that were more current during his parents' day. Finally, I'm going to real quick say that here are some outcomes that I've noticed. And again, I will have more detailed assignment sheets for you, and happy to answer questions about any of this stuff. I feel like I'm really blazing through. But I think it's really important that these kind of activities in the classroom, I've noticed, really decenter the idea of a 19th century Black canon. So more professional or non-professional writers kind of get invited to the party. So instead of being like, here's Paul Laurence Dunbar in my anthology, like here's Paul Laurence Dunbar surrounded by editorials and letters to the editor, and it's all a much more rich kind of environment. Students get to discover the larger print networks to which these authors belong, instead of kind of viewing them in these silos of, famous writer 1, famous writer 2, famous writer 3. Importantly, I think reading the newspaper and then picking what they want to talk about really empowers students to investigate what they're interested about, not only about an author, but also to investigate what they're interested in about Black life in the 19th century, because they'll all kind of be drawn to different things. And finally, I will say that students are hands down more invested in the time period after they do this activity, which for me as a teacher is so great. And finally, I just want to say you can do these activities in any kind of 19th century class, depending on what databases you have access to. So I have done them with success in this class on 19th century African American writers, 19th century American women writers, American poets, and a single author class on Emily Dickinson. So they're very adaptable. I know that was a lot, so thank you, and I'm done.
Thank you so much, Melissa. Yes, thank you. So we're just going to move swiftly on. So the content's just going to keep flying at you, okay? It's my pleasure to introduce Jennifer Phegley. Jennifer is speaking on, as you can see there on the screen, introducing periodicals to undergraduates, serial reading, blogs, and Wiki magazine projects. Jennifer chairs the English department at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. She's the author of Educating the Proper Woman Reader, Victorian Family Literary Magazines, and the Cultural Health of the Nation, and Courtship and Marriage in Victorian England, as well as several edited collections and numerous articles on authorship, publishing, periodicals, and pedagogy. So she has a current project, Magazine Mavericks, Mary Elizabeth Braddon, John Maxwell, and the emergence of new reading audiences in mid-Victorian England. Fantastic, so looking forward to that. And this has been supported by a Harry Ransom Centre Fellowship, a Curran Fellowship, and an NEH Summer Stipend. She notes also that she started teaching online courses in 2010, and she's here to tell us why she's never looked back. Over to you, Jennifer.
Thank you so much, Helena. Sorry, I started a little quickly with the slideshow, but in any case, I want to thank you so much also for inviting me to talk about two of my favorite subjects, teaching online and Victorian periodicals. And I'm going to dive right in. I've been teaching an asynchronous British Literature Survey course. It's one of the first courses I taught online, so I've been doing it for about a decade. And I quickly realized in trying to convert my face-to-face class online that I needed to adapt my assignments and make them a lot more interactive. So for me, teaching online in an asynchronous environment requires constant interaction among students and between the instructor and the students to keep it lively and you know, to always be having an ongoing conversation that seems present even though you're not interacting live. So the kinds of assignments that I turned to were, of course, discussion boards, which is the most obvious, but also blogs and wikis. And my course evolved as I began to use these formats into emphasizing student collaboration rather than solitary work. And I began shifting away from my own private grading and response to students towards a public feedback. And so All of my students submit their work publicly on our course site, and I respond to them. While I do give them some individualized comments, I give the entire class feedback and comment on and quote from student work as I do that. And I do that twice a week in my class in response to discussion boards and blogs, which happen discussion boards early in the week and blogs later in the week. So I see myself as a teacher providing the course readings and structure while the students are generating the actual content of what's happening in the course. And I'm more of a facilitator and a responder while the students are constantly interacting. So why choose blogs? I moved to blogs because I felt like it gave a little bit more room for research and in-depth writing than the discussion boards. But I soon discovered that it also does some other things. It allows students to experiment with new ideas and give and receive constant feedback, practice building a focused argument in 500 words or less, paying attention to their audience, which I urge them to realize is actually their peers, as much or if not more so than me. And one way that focusing on their audience helps them write more engaging pieces is that they gravitate towards framing their analysis in 19th century context or contemporary culture. So it seems that the blogs, more so than research papers or other traditional assignments, helps them make contemporary connections or 19th century connections in their analysis. And finally, it allows for the incorporation of visual images, and I encourage them to use Wikimedia Commons for that. So in this particular survey course, I focus the blog on serial reading. So we read, I used to do Little Dorrit, and I've more recently shifted to Collins's The Woman in White. In our serial reading blog, students read the novel in multiple serial parts per week throughout the semester, and they respond to their reading as they go along. So students write a total of 5 blogs over a period of 9 weeks, and then they reply to at least 2 peers' blogs every week. The first blog that they write, and everyone writes the first blog, and then after that, they rotate weeks. It responds to an article by Sean Crawford called No Time to Be Idle, the serial novel in popular imagination. I had used some scholarly book chapters and other things, and I just found that with the beginning level of student that this online article is really succinct and to the point, and students like it a lot, so I use that. Alongside Wilkie Collins' How I Write My Books. And I asked them to think about how Crawford discusses the context of serialization and how it might compare and contrast with what Collins is claiming he's doing when he's writing a serial novel. So this generates some interesting points on the student's part to kind of see what was the author's perspective, and then what is Crawford saying the serial novel is doing and how it's functioning. And you can see I have more specific questions that I ask them to consider, and then everyone reads what everyone else has written and responds to it. So this kicks us off as we're waiting for the novel to develop and for the plot points to become more relevant so that students can pick up on things to discuss. And throughout the rest of the semester, we have 3 open topic blogs where students choose what they want to write about, and 1 in-depth periodical context blog, which is something I've added more recently. And I usually give them an extra week where they can write a final blog if they need to make one up, or they can make up comments that they may have missed. So for the open topic blogs, I suggest the following approaches. Some pretty basic ones, asking students to raise questions about the themes, character, plot points, asking them to provide a in-depth close reading of a specific passage that they find interesting, explain why they think it's interesting or significant, examine the beginning and ending of a serial part that we've read. So this gets them to be more attentive to how Collins is luring readers in at the beginning of a part and then keeping them wanting to come back for more at the end of a part. I also give them the option of focusing in on multiple narrators, which many of the students find fascinating in this particular novel, and what impact it has that we're getting all these different points of view. I also point them to the illustrations for the 1861 edition, which are reproduced by the text we use, the Broadview Press edition, or to go to the American serialization and look at the Harper's Weekly illustrations. Sometimes I have students who want to compare two sort of parallel illustrations, although they don't fit perfectly, and look at how the American context is producing an illustration differently from the British publication. And then finally, I urge them to make connections with blogs that other students have written, or to build on arguments that other students have put forth. And they do that, they can choose any of those topics 3 times a semester. And finally, we have the periodical context blogs. And this semester was the first time I did this, and I did it for the 3rd blog. I think that in future, I might delay it a little bit. I think it was a little bit overwhelming for beginning students, but I got some great responses. So I gave them Deborah Wynn's chapter from a book that focuses on the serialization of Collins's novel In All the Year Round. And then I pointed them to the Dickens Journal online, and I showed them how to navigate through that and how to find the pages of the magazine that corresponded to the issues of the novel that we were reading, or the issue, or the serial parts that we were reading. And then I asked them just to read through a particular issue, and very similar to what Melissa had discussed, choose one particular publication in that issue, an article, a story, or a poem, and explore the connections it might have to that particular serial part of Collins's novel. And I urge them to use Wynn as a guide, use her framework, or to take it in a completely different direction. And students made different choices. But I did find that some of them struggled when they weren't following the Wynn framework. So I might emphasize that a bit more next time. So the culminating assignment of the course is having the students take all the knowledge that they've built over the course of the semester and in small teams create their own magazine. So this is a creative assignment. It's an assignment that builds on the readings we've done, on the blogging that they've done, but also lets them bring in their own interests and creative abilities. So we use a course wiki, which is currently Canvas, which is a very unsophisticated wiki, which I'm not happy with. So I'd love to get suggestions about how to do something different. When I used to use Blackboard, their wiki was better. And then for a very short time, I had an amazing software called Confluence that allowed students to create actual layouts that were either 2 or 3 columns that had mastheads and places for images. The Canvas wiki is pretty lame. But in any case, they can still do the projects. So I give them the concept that they're supposed to choose a theme from the course, draw on authors that we've read or characters created by those authors, and have those authors and characters be the editors and contributors to the magazine. I start them off with a collaboration contract, which I'll go over in my last few minutes here. And I also want to point out that this is a collaborative project. They've been working in discussion board teams all semester, so they've been working with each other in various ways, as well as interacting on the blogs. But I do have them very clearly lay out what each person's responsibility is. And then I also at the end have them assess themselves and each other And they're graded not only on the final project, but on their assessments of each other's contribution and on their teamwork. So each contributor gets a different grade. So there's not a single grade for the project, and this alleviates some of the conflicts that can arise in collaborative projects. So the first part of the contract, these are the questions I asked them to fill out on the wiki. What's their focus of the magazine? Who's their audience for the magazine? What authors or characters that we read throughout the semester do they plan to use as editors or contributors, and why? What features would suit the particular magazine? Do they want to incorporate interviews, advice columns, advertising? What is it that they're interested in doing? And then I asked them to reflect on how the literary periods of Romanticism, Victorianism, and Modernism could highlight different approaches to the magazine's contents. Some students choose to focus on one period and the authors from that period. Some like to mix it up. And so I asked them to make a decision and give a rationale for that decision. The second part of the collaboration contract is about accountability. What is it that they're each going to do, and what are their deadlines? So how are they going to communicate with each other? How are they going to divide up responsibilities? Who's going to be the editor? Who's going to design the layout? Who's going to write what articles? Who's going to search for images? And then they also, I want them to describe the elements that they're going to put into the magazine, so they have a plan for the very specific contributions within those broader categories of jobs to do to put the magazine together. And then I asked them if they're going to use Google Docs or wikis, the wiki itself, or some other means of interacting with each other and sharing their work. And finally, they put together deadlines. I set the final deadline, but in a 3-week period, they have many other deadlines for each other. And we do a peer response session with all the teams reading each other's drafts. So that's something that's already built in. So quickly, this is one of the magazines, 2 pages from one of the magazines that a group developed. Their project was focused on Romanticism, and it was called The Hopeful Romantic instead of The Hopeless Romantic. And their editor was Lord Byron. So they've written an introduction to readers from Byron. On the first page, there was also a cover page, which I didn't include here. And then on page 5, they have a funny, feature about the Byronic heroes, the classic bad boy, or the one your mother warned you about, etc. So this group really focused in on romantic authors, characters, etc., and had them as their contributors. Here's another example of a group that crossed the literary periods that we covered and created a magazine for young ladies, The Feathering Swan, and they had collaborative editorship of their magazine, a character and an actual person. So Marian Halcombe and Isabella Beaton were the editors of this magazine. Despite the fact that Mrs. Beaton was involved, they have a feature on the truth behind the scandal of Lord Byron and Carolyn Lamb. So you can see where my students' minds were this semester. They also had an interview with Wilkie Collins and something on music and dancing for the season. But the page I chose to share with you is a feature of Mary Kingsley in travel writing. And here's just 2 pages from 2 other projects, a group that focused on Victorian authors and characters in their Innovative Woman magazine. Again, they chose Marian Halcombe as the editor, and they actually wrote part 2 of a serial tale with an introduction by Wilkie Collins. And then the final one is a group that focused on the modern period, and my favorite part of their magazine was J. Alfred Prufrock's Unfortunate Advice. So I will stop there and we can discuss later.
you very much, Jennifer. I now want to take both your and Melissa's courses. That I can't get over the creativity of those magazines. It's fantastic. Okay, so moving on to our third speaker. Lindsy Lawrence is here with us, and she's going to talk about indexing poetry in the digital classroom. Lindsy is Professor of English at the University of Arkansas at Fort Smith, and she's published work on Elizabeth Gaskell, serial poetry publication, and neo-Victorian themes in contemporary television series such as Downton Abbey. Her recent publications include an article on women poets in Blackwood's Edinburgh magazine, in Women, Periodicals and Print Culture in Britain, 1830s to 1900s, the Victorian period. She also published a recent article on the Victorian Christmas serial tradition in contemporary television, and Doctor Who for the Journal of Neo-Victorian Studies. So she teaches a variety of courses, I should say, in composition, cultural studies, and 18th and 19th century British literature, with a particular focus on publication history, gender roles, and digital humanities. She is co-director of the periodical Poetry Index. Thank you very much, Lindsy.
Hi, everyone. So hitting screen share. And so to make sure that you're seeing the screen, and like my students who will let me go on, yes. So, all right. So, well, hello. So what I want to show you today is more of a series of assignments. So they're both written assignments and some classroom activities that we did involving indexing poetry and 19th century periodicals for the Periodical Poetry Index. So as Helena said, I am a co-project director for the Periodical Poetry Index, alongside Natalie Houston and April Patrick. So just a bit of context here, periodical poetry is an open access research database of poetry published in 19th century British periodicals. It includes texts by 19th century British and American poets, poets from earlier periods, poems in English translation, and poems in languages other than English. Like many of us here, I have long incorporated periodical research and serial reading in my upper level Victorian literature classes, using the open access digital archive available through the Hathi Trust Digital Library and Google Books, but mostly through the Hathi Trust. My university is a regional state university in Arkansas, and up until recently, a subscription to C19 or even British Periodicals 1 and 2 was cost prohibitive for a variety of reasons. I will say, if no one has investigated it in a while, it's on sale. So yeah, I was surprised. You might want to check it out. So still, I wanted my students to have their own discoveries in the archive, an experience I had found so rewarding when I was doing my own studies, and one I wished I'd had as an undergraduate. Most of my students are undergraduates. We just recently added graduate programs. So while I couldn't provide my students with material experience of the archive the way I had been introduced to it, I could have them work with these digital surrogates. So I developed assignments and classroom activities around browsing 19th century periodicals in the open access archive. So, and as Natalie, April, and I progressed further on collecting data for periodical poetry, learning so much about poetry's function in periodicals, I also wanted my students to have that experience that we were having through indexing poetry. So I began devising a series of classroom activities, originally facilitated by being in a computer lab, introducing students to humanities data and indexing poetry from 19th century periodicals using the indexing process developed by April, Natalie, and I. Like everyone, I had to completely reshape what I was doing in my classes as we all turned to teaching fully online in March last year. While I'd had some experience teaching online, this wasn't one of the classes I had put online. So I didn't want to lose introducing students to digital archive and indexing, however. So I revised how I would set up the indexing assignment for my fall class, and that's what I'm kind of going to show you today. I think it can be modified back for the face-to-face classroom, obviously, and I think you could do this with an asynchronous, fully online class like what Jennifer was describing. But the class I was teaching was a digital humanities class where we did have virtual class sessions, 2 Zoom meetings a week. So I initially set these up so that one class period was focused on theory and modeling different digital tools. So we did synchronous annotations and perusal. I would screen share and the students would all be in perusal at the same time. We blogged in WordPress because, like Jennifer said, some of the blogging platforms with the various learning management systems are terrible, basic, not what you really want your students working with maybe. So the one in Blackboard's really bad. So we also looked at Voyant and we did some other activities on that class period that was focused on digital tools. And in the second class each week, we discussed Wilkie Collins' The Dead Secret, which we read in serial installments over 9 weeks. So as we finished reading The Dead Secret, students were asked to write a short 2 to 3 page periodical exploration of an issue or 2 of Household Words in which The Dead Secret appeared. So it focused the students browsing on 1 volume of Household Words because that serial appears only in volume 15, which made introducing them to periodical exploration a little bit more manageable, given that we were in the virtual classroom. And they were navigating between the copies and the Hathy, which were easier to browse and explore for them, and then the copies in the Dickens Journals Online, which provided them with author information and other metadata. So we also did this assignment before I introduced indexing poetry to the class. So they were familiar with the format of Household Words. They had kind of gotten their fingers into it, if you will. And they stopped being afraid they were going to break the digital copies. They were actually afraid of that. I don't know how they felt that way, but they did. So my goals for having students index poetry from Household Words were twofold. I wanted students to become familiar with the open access digital archive and the Hathy Trust and learn how to browse the issues for poetry. Next, I wanted students to become familiar with bibliographic data, the information they were going to collect about each poem they identified in the periodical, and then learn how to use Google Sheets. Indeed, for most of my students, a spreadsheet is a terrifying object. It's terrifying for a lot of people, I won't lie. So, and that actually proved to be the thing that was most unfamiliar to them and that they had the most kind of anxiety about playing around with was the actual spreadsheets. So over 4 virtual meetings, we indexed volumes 11 to 19 of Household Words as a class. While students did some work outside of our sessions, most of the work was completed in small groups during our virtual class. Using breakout rooms, each group was assigned specific volumes to index, but the groups could choose how they wanted to set up their workflow as long as they were using our form. And it kind of depended on their comfort level with screen sharing and the other kind of technologies. It also depended on their own kind of personal setup. So my virtual or synchronous class policies do not require students to be on camera. And I had students in the class, depending on the class period, who were not able to come off mute because they were also parenting, et cetera. And so because we were doing this about week 10 in the semester, students were comfortable with saying what they could and could not do and with using the different tools within the breakout room to be able to do this work. So all of the instructions and links students needed to do the indexing work, including this Google Sheet with guiding information on Household Words and the indexing form, were set up on the Blackboard site for the class, shared with the students in Google Drive. We're a G Suite campus, so our students are really familiar with using Google Drive. And we share the link to the Household Word guides in the chat for each session. This document also served as the starting point for the students, as it included information on Household Words, links to the volumes in the Hathy, and a link to the indexing form. They didn't have to go to separate places for separate links for the different documents they were using. It's all housed here. So using the thumbnail view in the Hathy, students would scroll through their small groups assigned volumes, looking for pages with poetry. They would then note the page numbers in the Household Word sheets. It goes back over here. And then using our indexing form set up for these particular volumes, they would index the poetry. This part is actually pretty straightforward for students. They get into a rhythm with it pretty quickly once they figure out how to navigate between the form and what they're looking at in the Hathy. So as they're working in groups, and they came up with, each different group came up with their own workflow, depending on their technology constraints. So some groups had one person looking in the volume, another person indexing, and they were sharing information via chat. Some groups got really creative and would have one person screen share, and they would tile the view. So they had the indexing form and the happy side by side. Like they just played around with the technology and made it work for them. So after the students completed their indexing tasks, we came back as a whole for one class period, and I demonstrated how to use the data they had collected to do some basic data visualization. I warned them the data was raw. There was going to be some errors and some corrections, that the visualization we produced may not be accurate because of that. So using a copy of the data collected, I demonstrated how to make pivot tables, and then how to use that information to make a chart or graph like this. This is as close as I've ever gotten to doing magic in front of people. It really, once you're used to using pivot tables, it doesn't seem that way. But in this particular instance, students are fascinated and they're like, how did you do that? So you have to demonstrate it several times. They then made their own copies of the Google Sheet so they could experiment with making pivot tables on their own. And I did demonstrate how to do this work in Excel. It's located in a slightly different place. If you're looking for where to make the pivot table, it's in an insert space in Excel. But by this point, the students were way more comfortable using Google Sheets. They all found Excel more terrifying, actually. So using this data, the students then wrote a follow-up assignment of 2 to 3 pages in length, asking them to analyze the data using at least one visualization they had created. In some ways, and I found this fascinating because I thought this was going to go horribly awry, this assignment worked better in the virtual classroom than it ever has in the face-to-face one, in part because I had to be really more deliberate in how these assignments were scaffolded and how they worked together. As those of you who've taught full online for a while know, that deliberate linkage that you have to make in an online environment really does improve student understanding. And because I was recording these class sessions, students could also go back and watch the demonstration section of our class and see it again and get familiar with it and then try it on their own. I also think it was more effective because by the point we were doing these assignments, we were over half a semester into everyone having to do all of this work digitally. Students were just a lot more comfortable with their own individual digital discomfort. And they were more comfortable with expressing when they found things hard or disorienting. They were more comfortable asking for help, asking for something to be demonstrated again. And it also meant that students didn't think they were bad at doing this work, even though it didn't come to them easily. And oftentimes students are like, oh, I don't get it the first time, I must be bad at it. And in this case, they didn't feel that way. They knew it would take just some time to figure it out. And I think part of the joy of doing archival research and working with 19th century periodicals comes from that process of discovery, of just figuring things out, even if that process right now is occurring online. So thank you. And where's the stop share button? There it is.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. Yeah, pivot tables were the bane of my existence when I worked in publishing. So I think I also now need to take your class. So, you know, I'm just resign myself to the fact that I need all of these courses in my life. So finally, but by no means least, as the saying goes, we have Jim Mussell, who's going to talk to us about mechanical exigencies and the enabling difference, looking again at the look of the page. Jim is Associate Professor in Victorian Literature at the University of Leeds. He's the author of Science, Time and Space in the late 19th century periodical press and the 19th century press in, sorry, the digital age. When someone screen shares it, I can't see my notes anymore. He's one of the editors of the 19th century serials edition and books on, excuse me, W.G. Said and Oliver Lodge. His current monograph project, Whispers of Print, is working on, sorry, and he's also working on an edited collection on letterpress printing. Thank you, Jim.
Really sorry about that. Also apologies for the title. It's really pretentious and clunky, but it's because Helena asked me for a title and I thought, well, it's got to have a colon and a quote. And then it became this big thing here. But I'm kind of, well, for me, I was thinking about what's great about teaching online, and it's the readiness with which you can show people what pages look like. And then that got me thinking in turn about what those pages are and how to get students to think about the pages that they're viewing. And this got me thinking in turn about the work that I was doing in my own research at the time. And the phrase mechanical exigencies comes from hang on a second. Comes from an article by Dickens in Household Words called Trading in Death. And it was first published on November 27th, 1852. And it's an attack on the way people were cashing in on the state funeral of Wellington. And Dickens wrote the article the night before the funeral and then blamed the mechanical exigencies of the journal for missing out on the big day. But the article's notable because of the way it quotes and excerpts advertisements from the Times. And so the idea here is that Dickens is using actual adverts from the Times as specimens of this kind of horribly commercial, dubious activity that's going on. Kathy Waters has a great discussion of this article in her book on commodity culture in Dickens's Household Words. I'm thinking about it at the moment for what it says about time and ephemerality, because they're adverts in a daily newspaper brought into a weekly periodical, and been thinking about indexes and stuff like that. But now I want to use it to think about what I think is really good about teaching with digital resources, which, as I said, is it makes it easy to see the look of 19th century prints. Now at Leeds, we're teaching Trading in Death as part of, we're using Penguin's quite nifty, cheap little book called Night Walks, which is more or less bits of Dickens's Uncommercial Traveller plus Trading in Death tacked on at the end. And I'm not sure where this book has come from, and I'm still trying to understand it bibliographically. John Drew gave me some good hints of places to look to find out about what this derives from. Because Trading in Death is last, but it was the first one of the articles to appear in Household Words. So something's going on with the editing here, which I'd like to know more about. It's also not an Uncommercial Traveller essay, and it's never really collected in the 19th century in collections of Dickens's non-fiction. So I'm curious as to how it's ended up in this nifty, cheap Penguin book, but it's great for teaching with. And Penguin have made a good attempt at keeping the appearance of those newspaper advertisements. I can't show you because my copy of the book's in my office. You know. But they've made an attempt to recreate the typographic form of those advertisements, but it doesn't look like a periodical anymore because it no longer has the household word columns. And so in turn, the newspaper advertisements don't look like newspaper advertisements because they're also not in a column anymore. So no, Household Words has, because it's in columns, it makes the adverts look like they're in columns as well, because they are. It doesn't work so well in the book. So Household Words is absent here, but so's the Times in a difficult way too. But because we live in a world with Dickens journals online in it, it's easy to point students to the actual to the page images, and so they can see what's going on here. And you know, and because Household Words is in ProQuest British Periodicals and in the Hathi Trust Digital Library, you can get hold of PDFs and you can use those to view them if it's easier than clicking through page by page in DJO. Now, ideally, all this digital work would take place alongside seeing some 19th century print culture as well, right? To see what the stuff actually looks like. As we all know, digital reproductions can't capture all aspects of the printed object. Students don't get size and smell and weight and color. And it's tempting, isn't it, to see print as richer and fuller, the authentic point of origin for the digital representation. But I think when we use digital resources, we have to kind of fight back against this a little bit, or at least think a bit harder about the processes of remediation. And when we're teaching periodicals, I always want to sort of emphasize that or challenge the idea that print is somehow fixed and solid and an unchangeable object. And at the same time, challenge the idea that computers are just kind of mimesis machines that create representations. Because if we do that, then they're kind of doomed in this logic of deficiency. They can only produce versions of periodicals that aren't as great as the actual hard copy. And I want to kind of get away from that. I want students to embrace the mechanical exigencies, to embrace what I call pretentiously the enabling difference, right? To take that stepping away as an opportunity to look back again at print. Now, I know that this is difficult for my own practice, and I understand that in classes we've often got other things we need to do. But teaching why resources do what they do helps us, I think, to teach why periodicals in turn are as they are. And I was thinking about this morning. I examined a really, really good PhD on Cassell's illustrated family paper. I won't say who the person was. They passed and it was great, but it only happened this morning. I think they should probably get to announce the news themselves, but I'm quite happy to pass on the name. It was a great conversation that we had in the Viva. And we were talking about that moment in Cassell's illustrated family paper when it exists in two formats at the same time. You know, it's a bibliographical nightmare. It's both, it exists in its 8-page folio version, so like big, but at the same time, it's being printed as a 16-page demi-quarto, so smaller but longer. And as the student pointed out, the content's not the same either. I mean, so we've got this journal that's appearing at the same time in two radically different formats. It's the same amount of paper, it's just folded differently, but the content's different as well. But it produces a radical difference in terms of what the journal is, in terms of its place in the market, in terms of its appeal to readers, and how readers would bodily interact with it in a small and book-like or big and newspaper-like. We were talking about how this difference would be obscured in digital form. But at the same time, just as you need to know about printing techniques and the market to understand or to account for the significance of this difference between forms, so too, you also need to know about the production of digital resources to understand how and why this difference becomes erased. And so I was kind of interested in the mutuality of these two things. The history of production is important in both respects. Now, as periodical scholars, like, we understand the allure of the printed material, but we also understand that it's not really an original, that the thing that's in front of us isn't just one thing. And you know, to take Household Words as an example, the article that we're reading might be found in, it's in this single issue perhaps, but it's also in a monthly installment like this is. It could be in a bound volume, right? It exists in multiple formats. We're only reading one copy of the magazine. It exists in, you know, tens of thousands of other copies originally, and each one of those copies has its own history as it's come down to us through time. And of course, Household Words, like all periodicals, a single issue has a relationship with its predecessors and those to come as well. It exists as part of a run. That's what makes it a serial. So for me, it's not about going back to the page, or rather it's about going away from the page so that the page becomes something different. And that's what digital resources allow us to do. And so in my example, using the Times Digital Archive, I've not done this with students, but it's the kind of thing that I've got in mind as something to do. It's really easy to track the advertisements, right? They can go out and they go and find the originals and then see how Dickens has edited them. And he only edits them lightly, largely to diffuse them as advertisements. He's not giving away advertising space in Household Words. But doing this, it reveals the kind of intertextuality of periodical culture. It reveals that these are real advertisements, of one thing, that they've been edited, that the adverts do register the look and the content of the times. And you can't do any of this using the Penguin book, nor can you really do it just using Household Words. It's really hard to find these adverts if you can't search them digitally, because, you know, pages of the Times are dense. So this sort of thing becomes really easy. And I think too, searching for advertisements across the press is a really good way to descend to authorship, or to just look at relationships between journals in different ways. For me, the mechanical exigencies of digital resources trouble the reassuring edges of printed pages and issues and volumes. But what's wrong with edges? Well, as people have been demonstrated so well, people have been working on reprinting, for instance, thinking Melody Beals and Ryan Cordell, amongst others. Digital resources make really apparent the promiscuity of texts. They're printed in different times, in different spaces, and they mean different things. And there's all these material transformations too, from sheets to pages, from issues to volumes. And finally, there's the problem of time, of the reproduction of forms, of issues after issues appearing, meaning different things because they're in different moments. And I appreciate that sometimes we just need to show students what a page looks like. But I think that's the start, not the end. The look of the page is important because it reasserts the page's materiality. But the material edges of the page don't enclose everything that a periodical is. For that, we need remediation. And for that, I think we need the enabling difference. Thanks.
Another fantastic paper. Gosh, thank you all so much. I just have to say something now. We've just had a few people join because, of course, many of you will have seen that we had this mix-up with the time difference. So those who are attempting to enter now or are entering now, what I can say is that all of these great papers have been recorded. So we're about to enter the question period, which of course you are more than welcome to stay for, but you have missed in the synchronous sense the papers, but you can catch up on them later. I'd really love to open things out now. Two questions, which you can either pop in the chat or use the raise hand function if that's working. I can always ask a question if people are still thinking, but please, I'd rather. Troy, come straight in. Thank you.
Oh, I didn't think I'd be first. No, those were all great papers, and I've got some really great ideas there. Just to pick up on what Jim was talking about, I've always kind of felt frustrated when I have my students use the digital tools that they don't know what the actual item in its physical form looks like. So they see a Times page, or a page of the London Times, and they have no context for how like huge this would have been. And I got this idea from a conference several years ago. I think it was a Sharp conference of some librarians who would have students do a couple activities in which they would use the digital thing, and then they would have to ask questions about its materiality, like how big is the page in inches, or how big is, whatever. And then they would actually show them the items, and they would be kind of shocked at either how big they were or how wrong they were, because everything on the screen looks essentially the same size. So this is an idea I've stolen in my own classroom when I can, is to try to bring in like a Victorian periodical or something and show them that this is actually what it looks like. And they're all kind of like, first they're just scared to touch anything. There's like, oh my God, it's 100 years old, I can't touch it. But then how quickly they start questioning like how they, the scanned versions versus the physical object, and what gets kind of lost in translation. So it's more of a comment than a question, but great, thanks.
I think that's a really good exercise, actually. I like that it's got a reveal as well. Like, ta-da, this is what it actually looks like. I really liked a phrase that Lindsy used about individual digital discomforts. And I think I'd like to kind of embrace that, and just like Lindsay's doing so well in her classes, and getting students to reflect on that, not be scared of breaking stuff, And I think that applies to using, don't tell librarians, I said they're probably fine with this, but like with print culture, with hard copy as well. I think that students do feel, you know, people fetishize the aura, but it can also be disabling too. And I think there's a kind of individual print discomfort too can occur. So I mean that should also be embraced.
Thanks, Troy.
Can I jump in for 1 second too, to just this real quick, like sometimes what I do, because my library doesn't have any interesting archives of old newspapers, so it's all digital for me. But sometimes I will go to the printer in the main office where I teach, and I will print out the biggest paper possible to try to get it the size that it would have been. And I actually take different pages from different newspapers strategically chosen, and I hand them, this is face-to-face obviously, I hand them out to students and I say, okay, find the author. And then they just have to go through and look. And it's really fun. It seems like it might be silly, but it's super fun for them. So, and then they're just like, how could this be so big? And yet the print is still so small. So they do get a little bit of a tactile sense.
And then they understand the need for magnifying glasses as well, or why so many of our eyesights have gone to pot. So can I invite other questions, other comments?
I have a question. I am curious to know, a lot of your presentations talked about collaborative work in a classroom and having peer groups be the audience that students are keeping in mind as they're doing this kind of research and these classroom projects, which I think is excellent. And Lindsay, it sounds like the data that your students are generating goes into your website, which is great. I'm just curious to know, in a project like yours, Jennifer, if you have the blogs and the more outward-facing, I guess, elements of your classroom assignment accessible truly in the public realm, or are they limited to the students in your class? And if you do have them out in the public, what kinds of permissions and what kinds of platforms and such have you found to be helpful?
Yeah, that's a really good question. My campus has been very discouraging about having student work be public facing. And so I've been hesitant to do that, although we've just, and this is one reason why there's a problem with the blog tools on the course management systems or the wiki tools, and if they're terrible or not, because wanting to go outside becomes a little bit problematic. I mean, you have to get permissions from all the students. It's a little bit difficult when, I think it would be easier for the final project, but when it's work in progress all semester, students are probably a little more squeamish about that. But my campus did just get the Google Suite, and Blogger is included on Google Suite. I haven't had time to play around with that, and the semester was already underway, so that's one possibility I'm considering. But one of the reasons why they went ahead and did that is there are ways you can lock that down. So you can use Blogger but not have it be public, or you could have it be public. So that's something I need to think more about going forward. And of course, the work that I shared with you, I didn't get permission to share. So if and when the slides are shared, I will take the student examples out. But yeah, I think the students they very quickly become willing to share their work with the entire class. And that's not a problem at all. I mean, when I first switched from face-to-face to online, I was wondering if students would be worried about it, but I think actually students kind of show off. I mean, I think it brings out the best in the students because they want to impress their peers. If they're just giving the work to their teacher, like, yeah, they want to get a good grade, but they're not worried about, impressing you, but they want to impress their peers. So I think that's like one element that I feel like the blog writing is actually better than the writing I used to get from, you know, individual papers that they would just submit to me personally. I hope that answers your question.
Joanne?
Yes, just on responding to Jennifer, a few years ago, the Victorian Studies Centre at Leicester collaborated with Dickens Journals Online in a number of reading blogs, which were public. And it did add a new tension to it. It was fun, but you never knew who was going to respond, so that I could see, I remember there was somebody in Australia, you know, who, because they were 12 hours ahead, was always, you know, getting in before me. And I used to sort of go to enormous lengths to be sure I was ahead. So it adds a new dimension. It's not a bad dimension, but it does up your game, but it might not be something you want to inflict on students.
Yeah, and I do think there's a little competition. I mean, students are noticing who gets the most comments on their blogs. Yes. But I actually see that as a positive thing, because the blogs that are sort of models get the most response. I mean, so I think students start to see what is working and what isn't, and then they adapt as the semester goes on.
Yes, there's nothing more devastating. Yeah, there's nothing more devastating when nobody responds. You know, you realize.
Yeah, and that rarely happens, but it can happen.
Sorry, Lindsay, did you have something to add to the conversation now? Sorry, I cut you off.
No, it's fine. I was going to say there are ways with the more public blog platforms like Blogger or WordPress to have students blog in a space that they're seeing other people write in and other people publish in, without it being public facing. You can make it just available to the people who have the link to the blog and who are, I've used Blogger before. WordPress has more finesse to it than Blogger does in terms of the kinds of different levels you can have students be in terms of what their role is and their access to the dashboard side and kind of the tools they have access to. The great thing with using WordPress or Blogger is they can actually embed media into it as well. So they can embed video, they can embed pictures and hyperlinks. And so they get a lot more practice with digital writing that way too.
Yeah, and I think it depends. I mean, when I used Blackboard, we had a very robust version of Blackboard and students could incorporate all kinds of media. They can do that on Canvas as well. We have Canvas pages, but the pages are just very, it's like everything is just in a scrolling order. You know, there's no layout to be had in Canvas, which is why an interesting thing with my, I've only taught this class on Canvas twice, and this is the second time, so they haven't done their final projects yet. But the last time I said, don't worry about it, just do your wiki projects in the page. It's not that sophisticated, but it's fine. Only 1 of 4 teams did that. In fact, they just went without consulting with me, and some of them had access to various desktop publishing formats or different things from work. And they did their own, I mean, I don't even know how they created these things, because I didn't know until the end that they had done that. And they put them on Google Drive, and then they linked them from their Canvas wiki page. So I'm gonna have to figure out another strategy while we keep Canvas and don't have any more sophisticated wiki capabilities. But the blog, but you also on Canvas does not have a blog tool, for those of you who use Canvas. But it does have, I use, basically I adapt the discussion boards into blogs, and it works fine. There's a couple things you can do to make that work, but I won't go into the nitty gritty here.
Jim, did you want to come in on that before we take another question?
Well, I just wanted to invite Leslie to give us her experience, because she's got a great project working with students publicly blogging, and it's one that I took inspiration from when I first got into doing this. So is that okay, Leslie? Could you?
Yes, sure.
Yeah, certainly.
I was trying to find a link to something I wrote about it ages ago, but of course it's all a long time ago. If you're talking about when I taught my Victorian periodicals course in a history program, and I had volume of essays about various aspects of society. So, you know, politics, religion, women, blah, 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 blah. Every week I had the students read one chapter from that, one actual article from a 19th century periodical using the databases, and then the essay about the periodical in the Dictionary of 19th Century Journalism. So that was to give them context for where the thing was settled, but also another kind of broader context to what was going on, and that was. It's funny, I think now I partly used it because I wanted to kind of thank the university for subscribing to the databases. I wanted to make sure that students use the databases. But all these projects that we're seeing today are doing that. And one of the things I've been thinking is how we're really reproducing periodical scholarship by this kind of teaching in a way that, you know, a lot of historical and literary teaching doesn't reproduce the scholarship. It's separated from it. So it's really, you know, I'm sure each of you are creating the next generation of RSVP scholars here.
I can throw in a little bit too. I have a project where I do have students post work on a digital anthology. It's called the Victorian Short Fiction Project. And we've worked closely with our copyright office to make sure that the permissions that we give on that website for the student work are carefully handled. But I asked this because I'm really fascinated with the work that you were all presenting here. And I've thought about adding a blog to the site. Eventually I would love to do so, and I would love to have it be contributed to by both professional scholars and students at various different levels, and really have it be a kind of collaborative working space to think through short fiction within the Victorian periodical. But I haven't quite seen my way through all the details of that yet. So I'm really glad to hear what everyone's doing and what successes you've had when doing it. So thank you.
Thank you both, Leslies. And Katie has been waiting patiently with her hand up.
Thank you. Just get my technology sorted out. Yeah, I'm coming at this from a postgraduate perspective, and thank you all for this fantastic advice. It's given me so much inspiration. I'm really looking forward to the day when I can single-handedly craft a course where I can teach something serially, for example. But at the moment, I'm generally on courses that have already been written, and I get a 45-minute seminar. So the amount of opportunity I have to introduce digital resources can be quite limited. And I guess I'm a little bit anxious about trying to do too much in a small space. So do any of you have any recommendations about what I might do to incorporate this kind of teaching into, say, a 45-minute seminar where the content has been set, but I want to introduce some of these wonderful resources to students with limited time and space?
Go for it, Jim.
I can jump in for 1 second and say that so I have my first little activity that I didn't get to go through because I lack of time. It's just called Find the Author or Don't Find the Author, and you can really do it in about 10 or 15 minutes. And you don't have to do it for every author. You can just choose one. I like to do it at the beginning of the term with our first author, and then because it's interesting to find the author and to find their context, but it's also really interesting not to find them, and to see that maybe the periodicals that we're searching in weren't really interested in what the author was trying to get at or say. And so that it's fun, it's short, and you can incorporate it in a small way. And I am gonna figure out how to share my assignment sheets. I tried to post them in the chat and it didn't work, but I will find a way to get them to you through RSVP. So that's one thing that I do that might work.
Thank you, Melissa.
and I was just going to say sort of ongoing kind of project task-based things and giving students ownership to encourage them to go. It's just in the way that Melissa was talking about, give people a task, go find something very simple, and then let people have the freedom to roam and explore.
Yeah, I presume, I don't know, Katie, do your students all come with laptops? I mean, that's when we're obviously in the virtual world, that's obviously a kind of given, but you know, my experience of teaching in the UK, in the seminar space, you still get a bit of a mix between those who bring them and those who don't. So, you know, I suppose that's one thing to sometimes take into consideration.
So I've only taught in a face-to-face setting, so digital teaching would also be new to me. Yeah, so it was about 50-50 split in the seminar rooms when it was face-to-face.
So yeah, we will be sharing resources, but people have kindly agreed to share them. So we'll find a way to kind of circulate that and announce those shared resources. Can I invite any? I'm conscious of the time. Can I invite any final questions? Patrick.
Oh, well, I just had a quick question for Melissa. I just loved your talk. I was fascinated by it, and especially with those sort of social notes in the Cleveland Gazette about, you know, so and so was visiting from out of town, you know, and so was feeling ill this week, and so on. And part of the fascination with those, of course, is that those things are all submitted to the paper. I mean, it's not like there's a reporter out collecting all of these. A lot of them are, you know, this is, you know, our cousin came to visit from Grand Rapids, you know, and in my own work, which on small town American papers, you see this a lot, right up until the Second World War. In a lot of cases, you see this kind of thing, even for fairly large towns like Cleveland. And so it is fascinating to see it reproduced, see the same journalistic convention used in these African-American newspapers, where it lands differently, you know, in dealing with that specific community, and has different resonances. I wonder if you do any kind of comparisons about that with other kinds of other American newspapers, you know, and if yeah, I don't know if the whole notion of different newspaper conventions working differently according to the readership and the editorship of the newspaper.
It's a great idea. I haven't done that in that class, but I really want to now. I think that, so I teach a class on 19th century American poets. And so in that class, it's really open as far as which newspapers we look at, because it's not just focusing on, say, African-American writers or women writers, but it's lots of different writers from different backgrounds. And so there, we're really just kind of coming through all kinds of newspapers. And so that would probably be the class where we would, you know, we definitely notice like audience, you know, kind of what kinds of things. I think students notice that mostly in the ads, what kinds of things are being advertised. But I really love this idea of kind of being more deliberate in asking those questions. So thank you. I will steal that idea. I appreciate that.
Thank you, Patrick. So yeah, I mean, for those of you who can, I'd like to invite you to unmute and join me in a round of applause for our fantastic panelists. It's nice to just have a bit of the sound of applause every now and again. Yeah, really thought-provoking papers. I've got about 1,000 questions of my own, but I didn't want to use chair's privilege, so possibly expect some follow-up emails from me if that's all right. But you were going to get one anyway about sharing the resources. So thank you all very much for coming, and to our wonderful speakers once again. And hopefully we'll see you all at the next RSVP event, which Helena has just put details of in the chat. Thanks, everyone.